The rain didn't just fall. It attacked, hammering against the pavement like 1,000 tiny drummers. Relentless and unforgiving, Margaret Phillips pushed through the hospital's automatic doors. Her light blue medical scrubs already damp from the humidity that clung to everything in the city that night. 12 hours. 12 hours of back-to-back trauma cases, 2 codes, and one particularly difficult family who couldn't understand why their grandmother wasn't responding to treatment the way they'd seen on television medical dramas. Her feet ached with a bone-deep weariness that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, and her eyes burned from the fluorescent lights she'd been working under since before dawn. She fumbled in her bag for her phone, squinting at the screen through the sheets of water cascading from the hospital's awning. The rideshare app showed a black BMW waiting in the pickup zone, and she could barely make out the shape of a dark sedan idling about 50 feet away. Perfect. All she wanted was to collapse into the back seat, close her eyes, and let someone else worry about navigating through this monsoon. She pulled her jacket over her head and sprinted toward the vehicle, her sneakers splashing through puddles that soaked through to her socks immediately. The car was sleek, expensive-looking, with tinted windows that revealed nothing of its interior. She yanked open the back door and threw herself inside, gasping with relief as the warmth of the heated seats enveloped her exhausted body. "Thank God," she breathed, settling into the leather interior that smelled faintly of sandalwood and something else she couldn't quite identify. "I thought I was going to drown out there. You can just take me to Riverside Apartments, the complex on the corner of 5th and Main." She didn't wait for a response, already fishing through her bag for her earbuds, her eyes half closed against the dim interior lighting. The car was nicer than any rideshare she'd ever been in, but she was too tired to question it. Maybe the driver was new, trying to make a good impression. Maybe he was one of those guys who drove luxury vehicles on the side for extra cash. Either way, she didn't care. She just wanted to go home and collapse into bed, to sleep for 14 hours straight if her body would allow it. The partition between the front and back seats was up, tinted glass obscuring whoever was driving, and Margaret barely registered the figure sitting in the passenger seat beside her until she'd already buckled her seatbelt and let her head fall back against the headrest. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, catching a glimpse of a man in a tailored black suit, his profile sharp and angular in the shadows, his slicked back hair catching the ambient light. She should have said something, should have apologized for not noticing him, asked if this was a shared ride situation. But her body had other plans. The warmth of the car, the gentle hum of the engine, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof, it all conspired against her consciousness. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy, and before she could form another coherent thought, Margaret Phillips was asleep, her head drifting naturally toward the warm, solid presence beside her until it came to rest against his shoulder. Park Seo-joon had not become the head of his family's operations by being easily surprised. He had survived 3 assassination attempts before his 35th birthday, had navigated the treacherous waters of Seoul's underworld before expanding to the American market, and had built a reputation for being as calculating as he was ruthless. But when a woman in light blue medical scrubs threw herself into his car, rattled off an address like he was her personal chauffeur, and then promptly fell asleep against his shoulder, he found himself experiencing something dangerously close to bewilderment. He sat perfectly still, his hand frozen halfway to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, watching as the stranger's breathing deepened into the unmistakable rhythm of genuine sleep. Her hospital ID badge, clipped to her scrubs, read Margaret Phillips, RN, Memorial Hospital, above a photo that matched the peaceful face now resting dangerously close to his neck. There was a small stain on her sleeve, blood, probably the kind of stain that belonged to someone who spent their days in trauma rooms and emergency situations. Not a threat then, just an exhausted woman who had made a very unfortunate mistake. In the driver's seat, his most trusted associate, Min-joon, had gone rigid, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His dark eyes darted to the rearview mirror with an expression that suggested he was waiting for instructions. The kind of instructions that might involve disposing of an unexpected witness. "Sir," Min-joon whispered, his Korean crisp and urgent, tinged with barely controlled tension. "What do you want me to do?" Park studied the woman's face in the dim light. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with deep brown skin that seemed to glow even in the shadows of the car's interior. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion far deeper than a single bad day. There was something vulnerable about her in sleep, the kind of vulnerability that came from someone who had spent so long taking care of others that she'd forgotten how to protect herself. His eyes lingered on the curve of her jaw, the slight parting of her lips, the way her hand unconsciously gripped her bag even in sleep like she was afraid someone might take it. He recognized that instinct. He'd seen it in the faces of people who had learned that the world took what you loved. Something about her stirred something in him that he thought he'd successfully buried years ago. Something dangerous. The rain continued its frantic assault on the roof of the Rolls-Royce, a muffled drumming that only deepened the silence inside. Park Seo-joon sat motionless, the tailored wool of his suit jacket absorbing the dampness from the woman leaning heavily against his arm. He processed the situation with a cold, analytical detachment that slowly began to fray. In his world, people were either assets, enemies, or echoes of fear. But this woman, Margaret Phillips, was an anomaly. She breathed with a rhythmic, heavy honesty, her head lolling against his shoulder as if he were a sanctuary rather than a predator. His right hand, instinctively mapped to the cold grip of the firearm tucked beneath his ribs, remained frozen. Protocol dictated the removal of witnesses. Protocol demanded the elimination of variables. Yet, as his gaze drifted downward, he saw her hospital ID badge pinned to sky blue scrubs. Memorial Hospital. He studied the soft curve of her jaw and the dark circles beneath her eyes, marks of a different kind of war. She looked like she had spent the last 12 hours trying to hold the world together with nothing but her own two hands. In the front seat, Minjun's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He watched the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking between the road and the unthinkable image of a stranger using his boss as a pillow. "Sir." Minjun's voice was a low, urgent rasp in Korean. He was waiting for the word, the nod that would end the intrusion. Seo-joon didn't give it. Instead, he felt a strange, sharp pull of curiosity. "Drive her home," he commanded, his voice a velvet shadow. "Riverside Apartments." When Minjun's eyes widened in the mirror, Seo-joon added, "Slowly, we circle the block until she wakes. I want her to sleep." The car glided through the neon-slicked streets, a ghost in the storm. Seo-joon found himself unable to look away. Margaret murmured something incoherent, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag in a desperate, subconscious grip. It was a gesture of profound self-protection, the reflex of someone used to having things taken from them. For the first time in years, Seo-joon felt a flicker of something that wasn't calculated power. He wasn't sure if it was mercy or a hunger to understand how someone could be this vulnerable and still survive. When the car finally idled at the curb of her complex, Margaret stirred. She blinked, her eyes hazy with sleep as she realized she wasn't in a rideshare. She saw the sharp, tattooed lines on Seo-joon's hand and the predatory elegance of the man watching her. Panic flared briefly in her gaze, but it was dampened by a strange, quiet gentleness in his eyes. He didn't move. He simply watched as she gathered her things. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice thick. "I must have." "Go home, Margaret," he said, his voice level. He reached out, his tattooed fingers placing a small, heavy card into her palm. "You're safe." She stumbled out into the fading rain, her mind a fog. "Thank you for not killing me," she called out with a weary, nervous laugh that felt half like a joke and half like a prayer. She clutched the card, a single phone number embossed on black vellum, and disappeared into the lobby, certain she had just dreamt of a monster who chose to be a man. The morning sun filtered through thin, faded curtains, illuminating the sparse reality of Margaret's apartment. It was a space defined by necessity. A single bed, a stack of nursing journals, and a kitchen table that doubled as a desk for unpaid bills. Her life was a meticulously managed cycle of survival, leaving no room for high-end leather or the scent of sandalwood. Yet, for 3 days, the memory of the Rolls-Royce sat in the corner of her mind like a fever dream. She scrubbed her face and told herself it was a glitch in her reality, an exhaustion-induced hallucination. She told herself that men with tattoos on their necks didn't offer mercy. They offered headlines. Returning to the hospital was supposed to ground her. Instead, the sterile white halls felt flatter than usual. She pushed through another grueling shift, a blurred montage of beeping monitors and the heavy, stagnant air of the trauma ward. She navigated the grief of families who expected miracles on demand, her body operating on a dwindling reserve of adrenaline. By the time the sliding doors hissed open at the end of her double shift, her bones felt like lead. She scanned the pickup zone, her eyes searching for the humble, beat-up sedan her app promised. But the air suddenly felt pressurized, heavy with a familiar, silent gravity. Idling at the curb was a black BMW, different car, same lethal elegance. The tinted glass descended with a soft, mechanical whir, revealing the sharp, angular profile of Park Seo-joon. He didn't look like a rideshare driver today. He looked like a king waiting for a report. "Miss Phillips," he said. His voice was a low, resonant frequency that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate straight in her chest. "I need to speak with you." The rational part of her brain, the part that had studied science and calculated dosages, screamed at her to run. Her actual rideshare was pulling in 3 cars behind him. A safe, mundane exit from a world she didn't belong in. Everything about Seo-joon's stillness warned of a precipice. To walk toward him was to abandon the safety of the sidewalk for the uncertainty of the deep end. But Margaret found her feet moving before she could give the order to stop. It wasn't the accident of a tired woman this time. It was the deliberate step of someone who realized that for the first time in years, she was curious about something other than her own exhaustion. She reached the door, the cool metal of the handle familiar under her palm. She was choosing this. She was choosing the danger she had joked about 3 nights ago. She pulled the door open and slid into the heated sanctuary of the leather interior. As the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the pulse of the city, Margaret watched the hospital fade into the distance. She didn't ask where they were going, and as the central locks engaged with a heavy, final click, she realized she no longer cared. The interior of the BMW was a vacuum of sound. The city's chaos reduced to a silent, neon-blurred film passing outside the tinted windows. Park Seo-joon sat with a regal stillness, his hands, etched with dark, intricate ink, resting casually on his knees. The glass partition was raised, sealing them in an intimate, pressurized silence. He offered no name, no title, and no apologies for the mystery that clung to him like the scent of wood smoke and rain. He simply spoke with the absolute, terrifying confidence of a man who had never been told no. "I need a nurse," he began, his voice a low, melodic vibration. "Someone with your specific training to provide discreet medical care for members of my organization. The work is legitimate, Margaret. Vaccinations, chronic management, preventative checks. The kind of care my associates prefer to receive away from the prying eyes of public records and insurance databases." Margaret listened, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was careful with his words, threading a needle between the illicit and the essential. He promised her that her license would remain untarnished, that she wouldn't be stitching up bullet wounds in a basement or lying to the authorities. It was a job for people who lived in the shadows but still suffered from the mundane ailments of the light. But as she watched the light from a passing street lamp catch the sharp line of his jaw, she heard the unspoken truth beneath his offer. This wasn't just about blood pressure and flu shots. He was building a bridge. He wanted her within his reach, a fixed point of light in his dark, calculated world. He was curious about the woman who had used him as a pillow, and Margaret, to her own quiet horror, was equally curious about the man who had let her. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a card. It was heavy, black vellum with a single gold-embossed number. No name, no address, just a lifeline or a tether. "Think about it," he said, the shadow of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. My driver will take you home now. If you want a life that pays more than exhaustion, call me within 3 days. The car came to a smooth halt in front of her building. The weight of the card in her hand felt immense, a physical manifestation of the crossroads she now faced. She could return to the thankless, bone-grinding cycle of the hospital, or she could step into the gravity of a man who made her feel more awake than she had in years. For 2 days, Margaret stared at the card. She rationalized the choice with cold logic. The money would fix her debt. The hours would save her sanity. But on the third night, as the silence of her apartment felt more like a cage than a home, she finally dialed. The phone didn't even have time to ring. He answered instantly, his voice a dark caress that made her breath hitch. I'll take the job, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her soul. The clinic was not the dark, subterranean secret Margaret had braced herself for. Instead, it was a masterpiece of clinical efficiency tucked behind the facade of a generic warehouse. When she first stepped inside, she found high-end diagnostic equipment, a fully stocked pharmacy, and a staff that moved with the quiet discipline of a trauma team. There were no flickering lights or blood-stained floors. It was a sanctuary of sterile white and polished steel. The only difference between this and the hospital was the silence of the paperwork. There were no insurance forms, no government logs, and no names, just patients who arrived in tinted sedans, seeking the kind of care that didn't ask questions. Her days became a rhythm of quiet service. She treated sprained ankles from falls, administered flu shots to men with scarred knuckles, and managed the hypertension of associates who lived under constant pressure. It was good work, honest work, she told herself. She was helping people who had been discarded by the formal system. She told herself this justified the proximity to a man like Park Seo-joon. She told herself many things to keep the guilt at bay. But the danger didn't lie in the patients. It lived in the quiet intervals between them. Park was a constant, shadow-like presence, his heavy footsteps announcing his arrival before he ever appeared in her doorway. Their conversations began with the logistics of medical supplies but inevitably drifted into the intimate territory of shared time. He remembered the small things. A coffee from the specific shop she'd mentioned once, or a medical journal article on cardiac advances left on her desk with a handwritten note in sharp, elegant script. They began taking lunches in his office, the air thick with the scent of takeout and old books. Behind his desk, stripped of the terrifying theater of his business, Park was startlingly human. They debated the merits of classical music versus modern jazz and discussed the weary philosophy of people who lived for their work. When he spoke of his favorite Korean poets, the sharp lines of his face softened, and for a moment, the tattoos on his neck seemed like art rather than armor. In those moments, Margaret felt the world outside the clinic walls start to blur. The hospital felt like a distant, gray memory, while this hidden underworld pulsed with a vibrant, dangerous heat. Their eyes would meet over a shared joke or a quiet observation, holding a second too long, charged with a magnetic tension that made her breath hitch. She told herself it was just friendship, the natural camaraderie of two people who understood what it meant to be tired. She was lying. By the end of the first month, the realization hit her like a physical blow. She found herself checking the clock, counting down the minutes until her shift at the clinic began. Her heart racing not at the prospect of the work, but at the thought of the man waiting in the office. She was falling in love with a ghost, a king of shadows, and she knew with terrifying clarity that she could not afford the price of admission. Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, the low hum of her refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. Her fingers traced the edge of a framed photo from her nursing school graduation. The woman in the picture, wearing a stiff cap and a bright, idealistic smile, felt like a stranger from a different lifetime. That version of Margaret had believed in clear lines, black and white ethics, and the safety of the system. She looked at her hands, the same hands that now spent half their time in a ghost clinic, healing men who lived by the gun. What had happened to her? The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a beautiful, dangerous gray. Margaret tried to convince herself that the clinic was a noble compromise. She was providing care to the invisible, filling a gap that the sprawling city hospital ignored. But the lie was losing its structural integrity. It wasn't just the work that kept her coming back. It was the way the air in the room shifted whenever Park Seo-joon entered. When Park looked at her, it wasn't with the clinical expectation of the doctors at the hospital or the demanding desperation of the trauma families. He looked at her as if she were the only real thing in a world of shadows. He saw her, not the nurse, not the function, but the woman. One afternoon, as he handed her a file, his fingers brushed against her hand. The contact was brief, a mere spark of friction, but it sent a surge of electricity through her veins that left her breathless. She knew she was falling for a man whose life was a series of lethal secrets. She knew she should walk away while her heart was still mostly intact. She didn't. One rainy evening, the clinic was quiet. Park sat at his mahogany desk, his brow furrowed as he reviewed a ledger, the sharp light of the desk lamp highlighting the tattoos that climbed his neck. Watching him from the doorway, Margaret felt a sharp, painful crack inside her chest. He had become essential to her, a fixed point in her chaotic double life that she couldn't afford to lose. "I'm terrified," she said, the words slipping out before she could catch them. Park looked up, his dark eyes searching hers with a haunting clarity. "Of what?" "Of this," she whispered, stepping into the room. "Of you. Of how you make me feel. I'm terrified of loving someone I shouldn't." The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Park didn't move for a long moment. Then he stood slowly, his voice dropping to a low, vulnerable frequency. "I've spent my entire life learning not to care about anything. It was the only way to survive. And then you stumbled into my car, and suddenly, I care very much. I'm terrified too, Margaret." They didn't touch. They didn't move to close the distance. But the professional mask they had both worn so carefully shattered into 1,000 pieces. The pretense of just being a boss and an employee was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying honesty. When Margaret left the clinic that night, the cold rain felt different against her skin. She walked toward the bus stop knowing that the bridge back to her old life had finally burned. They hadn't acted on the feeling yet, but the truth was out in the open, and there was no going back to the way things were. The stillness of the clinic shattered at midnight when the heavy steel doors were kicked open, admitting a gust of freezing rain and the metallic scent of iron. Park Seo-joon was half-carried, half-dragged by Minjun, his tailored white shirt now a jagged map of crimson. The ambush outside the restaurant had been surgical, leaving Park with one bullet in the shoulder and another buried deep in his side. A trail of dark, thick blood followed them across the pristine tile, pooling beneath the examination table as they heaved him onto it. In an instant, the woman who loved Park vanished, replaced by the nurse who knew how to manage chaos. Margaret's training roared to life, her mind cataloging the trauma as she barked orders at a panicked Minjun to apply pressure. She cut away the expensive fabric of Park's suit, her hands moving with a precision that belied the frantic pounding in her chest. But as she saw the ragged entry wounds and the sheer volume of blood loss, her hands began to shake, a tremor she had never experienced in the busiest year. "I need to call an ambulance," she gasped, her voice cracking as she reached for her phone. "You're losing too much, Park. I can't stabilize this here." A bloody, tattooed hand clamped onto her wrist with surprising strength. Park's face was ashen, his eyes glazed with pain, but his voice was a desperate rasp. "No hospitals. They'll be waiting. You know the rules, Margaret." "Then you'll die," she shot back, tears finally stinging her eyes. "I'm a nurse, not a surgeon. I don't have the tools to dig these out. I can't fix you." For a heartbeat, the room disappeared, leaving only the two of them locked in a gaze of terrifying clarity. In his fading strength, Margaret saw a man who had finally found something to live for, and in her own reflection, she saw a woman who could not imagine a world where he was gone. The weight of her medical oath, her license, and her future suddenly felt light compared to the heavy reality of his heart stopping. "Minjun," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, decisive tone. "Call this number. There's a retired surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chun." The next 2 hours were a blurred symphony of monitors beeping and the smell of cauterized flesh. Margaret assisted Dr. Chun with a grim focus, her light blue scrubs becoming as stained as Park's shirt had been. They moved in silence, a clandestine operation that defied every law and ethical code Margaret had ever lived by. She was no longer just a healer. She was a co-conspirator. When the last suture was tied and Park was settled into a deep, drug-induced sleep, Margaret finally collapsed into a chair. Dr. Chun stripped off her gloves, looking at Margaret with a heavy, knowing exhaustion. "You love him," the older woman stated quietly. "It wasn't even a question for you." Margaret simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. "When this is over," Chun warned, "we're going to talk about the road you've chosen. There's no coming back from the shadows, Margaret." But as Margaret watched the slow, steady rise and fall of Park's chest, she knew the conversation was unnecessary. She sat in the dim light, listening to him breathe, and realized the woman who had walked into the wrong car was gone. She belonged to the shadows now. The shadows in the recovery room were long and soft, the air humming with the rhythmic pulse of the cardiac monitor. Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed, her light blue scrubs wrinkled, her eyes mapped with the red veins of 3 sleepless nights. She was watching the steady rise and fall of Park's chest when his hand twitched. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. The fog of anesthesia cleared in stages, and as his gaze finally settled on her, the sharp, calculating mask of the mafia boss was nowhere to be found. In its place was a man stripped down to his rawest, most vulnerable state. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice a dry, broken rasp that sounded like gravel over silk. Margaret reached out, her fingers tangling with his. "Where else would I be?" The silence that followed was no longer the cautious, guarded quiet of the clinic. The surgery had cut more than just flesh. It had severed the pretense they had both been clinging to. Margaret felt the truth bubbling up in her throat, a confession she could no longer suppress. "I'm terrified, Park," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm terrified of what I did to save you. I'm terrified of what I'm becoming. And I'm terrified of how much I need you to stay alive." Park's grip on her hand tightened, his knuckles pale. "And I don't know how to love you without putting a target on your back," he admitted, the honesty of it carving deep lines into his face. "In my world, love isn't a gift. It's a weakness that people use to destroy you." Then, for the first time, he led her inside the fortress. He told her about a boy in Seoul who had watched his father execute men over dinner. He spoke of the grooming, the weight of a legacy he never asked for, and the mother who had died in a crossfire trying to spirit him away to a life that never happened. He didn't offer excuses, only the cold, hard facts of the choices that had turned him into a king of shadows. Margaret listened, her heart aching not for the boss, but for the boy who had been forced to bury his soul to survive. She didn't flinch at the blood on his past or the ink on his skin. "You're not a monster, Park Seo-jun," she said, leaning forward until her forehead rested against his. "You're a man who has had to make impossible choices in a world that never gave you a fair one." He looked at her then, truly seeing the woman who had crossed every moral and professional line for him. The isolation that had defined both their lives dissolved in that shared breath. When she finally pressed her lips to his, the kiss didn't taste of passion alone. It tasted of a blood oath, a silent promise that the masks were gone for good. They were no longer a nurse and her patient or a boss and his employee. They were two broken people choosing to be whole together, regardless of the storm gathering outside the door. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, gilding the mahogany furniture and casting a warm glow over the breakfast table. For a moment, it was easy to believe in the illusion. Months of quiet mornings and stolen laughter had woven a tapestry of normalcy over their lives. Margaret still worked her shifts, but she returned to a man whose touch had become her compass. Even Park had changed. The sharp, lethal edges of his leadership had softened into something more measured. His ambition redirected from expanding an empire to protecting the woman who had saved his soul. But empires built on blood are never truly at peace. The shatter came on a Tuesday night. The air in the apartment shifted the moment Park stepped through the door. The darkness in his eyes was a physical weight, a cold shadow that extinguished the warmth of the room. Margaret felt the familiar dread of the hospital waiting room settle in her chest. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had seen the end of something. "They know, Margaret," he said. His voice a hollow echo as he pulled her into the circle of his arms, holding her with a desperate, crushing intensity. "The Yoon family, they've been tracking you. They have photos of you at the hospital, your apartment, the clinic. They've mapped every second of your life." Margaret felt a spike of ice crystallize in her veins. "Why? I'm just a nurse, Park. I have nothing to do with your business. You are everything to me," he whispered harshly against her hair. "And in my world, that makes you a target. They won't hit me. They'll hit you to watch me burn." In the days that followed, the man she loved began to vanish behind a fortress of ice. Park grew distant, his silence a wall he built to keep her out, believing that emotional distance could somehow act as armor. He retreated into the cold mechanics of power, his jaw perpetually tight, his eyes reflecting a violent, internal storm. Margaret refused to be sidelined. She confronted him in the center of the living room, the city lights shimmering behind her like cold diamonds. "Don't you dare shut me out," she demanded, her voice trembling but fierce. "We said we were in this together. You don't get to decide to be a martyr alone." The wall finally crumbled. Park's composure broke, his shoulders sagging as he let out a jagged, broken breath. The man who controlled the city's underworld, who moved lives like chess pieces, looked at her with a raw, agonizing helplessness. "I don't know how to love you without putting you in danger," he cried, his voice finally cracking. "Everything I am makes you a target. I can't kill enough people to make the world safe for you. My power, it's meaningless if it's the very thing that kills you. And that scares me more than death." In that moment, Margaret didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a wounded man standing in the ruins of his own life. The realization was a heavy, inescapable truth. Their worlds were fundamentally incompatible. They had reached the edge of the map. They could no longer coexist in the gray area. Either she would have to live forever in a cage of fear, or he would have to destroy the only world he had ever known. The air in Park's office was thick with the scent of old paper and the finality of a closing door. Scattered across the mahogany desk were the bones of an empire. Offshore ledgers, deed transfers, and forged passports that gleamed under the soft lamplight. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair as they traced maps of cities where they would be nobodies. The decision had been reached not with a bang, but with a quiet, mutual surrender. Park was walking away. He spent weeks meticulously dismantling a kingdom he had spent 20 years building, transferring authority to Minjun, settling blood debts with gold instead of lead, and ensuring his subordinates were protected. He was trading his crown for a life of anonymity, stripping himself of the only identity he had ever known to ensure that Margaret would never have to check her rearview mirror again. It wasn't a victory by the world's standards. He was losing a fortune and a throne. But as he looked at the documents, his face lacked the tension that had defined him since childhood. He turned to her, reaching up to cup her face with his tattooed hand. The ink on his skin represented a past he was leaving behind, but the look in his eyes was entirely new. "I spent my entire life building power so I wouldn't be powerless," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. "And the only real power I ever had was the choice to love you. I choose you, Margaret, always." The finality of the choice settled over them like a blanket. Margaret saw the sacrifice for what it was, not a loss but a liberation. She was leaving behind the hospital that had drained her, the apartment where she had barely survived, and a system that had never truly seen her. In return, she was gaining a man who had seen her once in the back of a car and decided the world wasn't worth having without her in it. The sterile hum of the airport terminal felt worlds away from the shadowed clinic. Hand in hand, they moved through the crowd, two faces among thousands. Margaret felt the weight of her new passport in her bag. A different name, a different life. She paused for a single heartbeat to look back at the city skyline, a silhouette of a past life that no longer fit. When she turned back to park, she saw him watching her, waiting. He wasn't the boss anymore. He was just the man who held her hand a little tighter when the world grew loud. She understood then that home wasn't the riverside apartments or the hospital wards. Home was this, the person beside her, choosing her in every breath, in every mile. They stepped toward the gate, disappearing into the sea of travelers, heading toward a horizon without a map. For the first time since that rainy night in the back of a Rolls-Royce, neither of them was afraid.